it's not just destruction that is profitable here, but the reconstruction plan is the real bounty that we see in Gaza, like in many other places.
The key is, previously the economic peace was about stabilizing the two-state solution. Now, essentially, the economic peace is about voiding the two-state solution, so you no longer have to take it seriously. And so this Gaza plan is the material realization of that. You obliterate, Gaza, which is one of the great kind of wounds of Palestinian history. You literally just pave it over and build a mall and build a hotel complex and a EV manufacturing zone and a big solar field. So that's the kind of underlying logic here, is that we move from economics as a stabilizer of the two-state solution to economics played at an even bigger level now, mega high-tech Israel with mega wealthy Gulf. They explicitly say this is going to be run by they're going to be run by technocrats. It's not common for technocrats to literally write, "I am technocrat" on my forehead. Like, people label you technocrat once you're doing technocratic things. But in this case, they literally say there will be a technocratic government and it will be overseen by a board and the whole thing will be a Trump program. It's like that ghastly AI fantasy actually come to life. It's quite astonishing in how blatant it is, really.
Right. And it's about this plunder being disguised as some form of expertise, something that we also see in other contexts, such as Ukraine. Professor Adam Tooze is Catherine and Shelby Cullum Davis Professor of History at Columbia University and the director of the European Institute. He is author of many prize-winning books, including The Deluge, Crashed, and his famous Wages of Destruction, The Making and Breaking of the Nazi Economy. Adam, your scholarship is vital in this historic moment because it shows how deep historical work and a global perspective can help us emancipate from propaganda and untruths that are covering up one of the worst historic crimes in history. My great aunt, Clara Mattei, actually was expelled from all the schools in the Kingdom of Italy in 1939 when she denounced the racial laws against the Jewish people in Italy. And we know that it takes a lot of courage today to speak up persistently about the conditions of genocide in Gaza. Your work really is important because it helps answer one question that I would like to start with, which is the question I get a lot, which is, why do you focus so much on Palestine? Why is it all this fuss? How is it that we don't also look at other contexts of suffering around the world? So before we get into what I would like to do with you today, which is explore the connection between militarism, the economy of Reconstruction, and fundamental austerity, I would like for us to focus on this question. Why Gaza? Why is Gaza so important historically for us to focus on? And why is it not like what we've seen before?
Well, first of all, you do me too much honor in putting me in the same category or mentioning in the same breath as a famous anti-fascist resistor of the 1930s. But this question, I think, is urgent. I mean, it's also one that's, of course, highly politicized. The politics of comparison is part of the politics of the denunciation of anti-Semitism. The claim that critics of Israel apply double standards and apply to Israel standards they don't apply to other places is part of the apparatus through which allegations of anti-Semitism are made. And my response to that has been just a calm willingness to roll with the punch and say, right, okay, let's do the comparison. This isn't difficult to do. Like, UN agencies the world over do comparisons of situations of famine. And there's a huge amount of scholarship on issues of scholasticide in many of the places to which Gaza is commonly compared, and where people make the objection that by focusing on Gaza, we're ignoring, for instance, the absolutely dramatic crisis in Sudan, or the situation in Myanmar, or in DRC. And so what I've done in two pieces on my newsletter chart book is to simply say, well, okay, fine, let's take this pushback and go with it and pose the question, in what ways does Gaza seem singular? And as soon as you do that, it's perfectly obvious that it stands out above all, simply for the deliberateness with which a enormously overpowerful Israeli state, which has all of the resources of a highly sophisticated economy at its disposal, from a position of absolute safety with the massive support of major powers all over the world, including, of course, the United States, which is paying for a very significant fraction of the damage that Israel has inflicted and the violence it's inflicting. The deliberateness with which this overpowerful state is embarking on the destruction of Gaza and the infrastructure of life in Gaza. There are destructions of universities in Sudan right now. There is famine, hunger across large parts of the DRC, for instance. But the deliberateness with which this is being inflicted, the siege conditions, the asymmetry of power, the openly articulated project of ethnic cleansing, making space for an eventual incorporation of Gazan territory in the view of the right wing of Israeli politics, and makes this a absolutely singular case. So the effect of the pushback, which says, you're ignoring all these other global crises and you really ought, in fairness, to compare and apply the same standards. The weird element of that argument is that the more you actually do that, the more you see the singularity of what is going on here. And I don't think, therefore, that anyone who is serious about thinking about the Gaza situation or with the Gaza situation, about the world that we're in, should ever flinch from this comparative question. And it's an invitation also to inform ourselves about what is going on in Sudan, for instance, and the damage that's being done there. And it's quite clear that a very large part of that country's important university infrastructure has been disrupted. And there are many, many scholars in exile who are documenting this. And what their painstaking inquiries show is it really doesn't bear comparison with the application of massive amounts of aerial bombardment and heavy artillery to the destruction of Gaza's educational infrastructure. So that's what this comparison shows us. And it poses a whole series of questions about how on earth this could be possible, right? What makes Gaza a potential target for this kind of destruction, which is unique in the world in its intensity and its deliberateness and its asymmetry in the current moment.
Thank you, Adam. So important. The two chart books that you're referring to are the one on Scholasticide 349 and the 400 on Murder, Not Crisis, Why Israel's Starvation of Gaza is Exceptional in a Global Context. And you end with very strong words that I would like just to read. Anyone deflecting from the clear responsibility of the Israeli state for this mass starvation of 2 million people, anyone resorting to euphemisms about crisis, make themselves complicit in this historic crime. So I would like to follow up what you just said. How is it? This is a question you ask actually in another chart book called Gaza Beyond Development to Disposability and Destruction. What does make these 2 million people so easily to be disposed of? And this whole Gaza so absolutely objectified. What is the history behind this? And I know it's very complex, but can we at least give a sense of how we got here?
I mean, the central thing to understand about Gaza is that its current position is absolutely anomalous in a history which stretches back literally thousands of years. William Dalrymple has been doing an amazing job on Twitter of reconstructing Gaza's history in a series of, I think, podcasts and certainly extraordinary Twitter posts about this region, this area, this series of settlements that for large parts of the ancient history of the Mediterranean were absolutely organic and central and considered some of the more sophisticated flesh pots of the Eastern Mediterranean. The modern history of Gaza begins with the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, Gaza becoming in the context of the Nakba, a major site for Palestinian refugee congregation at a time when its access to Egypt was still vital and open. And it's really the 1967 war and the massive Israeli territorial gains at that moment that constitute the modern Palestinian problem as we know it. Nakba is the beginning, but in the early phases of Israel's history, the Palestinian question was occupied second place, really, to the history of Arab nationalist opposition. The 56 war is really about that story. And from 67 onwards, however, we see the modern configuration of the occupied West territories of the West Bank and Gaza as an enclave. But through the 1980s, Gaza was really like the West Bank today. One could think of them as following a relatively parallel evolution, which is as dependent labor reserve enclaves for the Israeli economy. And it's in that context that Roy, the great political economist of Palestine, spoke about a context of de-development, so a context in which Palestinian incomes, in fact, tended to go up, and the measured GDP in these regions went up because so many migrant workers were finding work in the Israeli economy. But on the other hand, there was no actual development taking place because essentially what people were being, the Palestinian territories were being reduced to the status of like commuter labor suburbs, and Palestinians were being inserted in very subordinate positions into the Israeli labor market. And this model breaks with the Intifadas, with the first Intifada in the late 80s and then the second Intifada in the early 2000s, because which are themselves, especially the first Intifada, a kind of classic economic crisis-driven social protest movement, originally by migrant workers. The Intifada is triggered by a car accident, a truck accident, in which a group of Palestinian migrant workers are killed by an Israeli truck, which then triggers what initially is a labor protest. It's a general strike, essentially, by the Palestinians against the Israeli economy, which the Israelis recognize their vulnerability to. And then from the 1990s onwards, as Israel goes through its own crisis-driven neoliberal reconstruction, with Netanyahu emerging as one of the great spokesmen of this new neoliberal high-tech vision of Israel, is one of the things that Israel does is not just to begin to anchor itself in the the promise of the two-state solution and the deal with the Americans and the Europeans, but also to render itself increasingly independent of Palestinian labor supply by importing more and more migrant laborers from around the world. Israel becomes the cosmopolitan kind of place that people know it as today. Meanwhile, in Gaza, the extreme conditions there are producing the radicalization which sees the emergence of Hamas, and Hamas then becomes the key protagonist of the second Intifada, and then ultimately the seizure of power between 2006 and 2007, which produces a massive divergence within the Palestinian territories between the West Bank, which remains in that position of a kind of dependent, subordinate labor reserve location and continues to see some GDP per capita growth, though not really development, and Gaza, which from 2007 is essentially placed under siege. And in that space then, in that siege economy, you have a tight-knit political economy in which local initiative, within Gazan society, you see the emergence of various types of social groups which mobilize to build this extraordinary tunnel economy. And Hamas then sits as a kind of controlling agent on top of that. We think there are about 1,500 tunnels, essentially commercial operations in large part, where people basically dig a tunnel for a couple of $100,000 and then charge fees on it. And an extraordinary siege economy emerges, which is then repeatedly hammered and throttled by the Israelis on the one side and the Egyptians on the other. And it's that which really creates this incredible divergence, so that even before the current shocking train of events, Gaza had become a totally precarious, fragile, aid-dependent, improvised siege economy, which is why people talk about it as essentially like an open-air prison camp. It's this story of divergence which intensifies with the military operations of the 2010s and the military takeover in Egypt from 2013, which is very opposed to Hamas, because Hamas is organically descended from the Muslim Brotherhood, which are the people that the Egyptian military coup against in 2013. And so Gaza finds itself trapped between those two locations. And really, so rather than, there being a long history of Gaza as some sort of appendix that can just be willfully cut off, it's really only in the last 20 years, 15 years, really, since the onset of the siege in 2007, that it's been reduced to this status of just a battlefield. I mean, that piece, I wrote it in the aftermath of those utterly cynical Israeli orders to like 1 million people to evacuate a space which they were just going to make into a battle space. That's really the backdrop of this dissociation of Gaza, 2 million people from the rest of the world.
Emblematic of the siege is, of course, the bombing of the airport and the complete destruction also of the fishing industry in Gaza. And of course, you're right that by 2015, half of the population was dependent on aid. Now we know the numbers are even higher. So it's interesting because this tunnel economy as a way to evade what was ultimately a closure of economic possibilities stands in stark contrast with the Trump plan and Netanyahu plan for the Gaza after the genocide, because the Gaza after your genocide, you describe as a glossy hallucination, but made of a globalized space in which the global trade becomes central. I'd like to read a passage from a chart book that you wrote earlier on, actually, in May 2024, when the plans that we're seeing currently being discussed as we speak for a Gaza peace, so-called peace plan, were already in the books. And you write the following: Netanyahu's Gaza 2035 is a plan to complete the erasure of Gaza. In its place, the Israeli government envisions a mega-rich clone of a globalized commercial and industrial city, somewhere between Chicago, what historian Willem Krohn described as nature's metropolis, and Dubai. As Netanyahu himself observes, Gaza 2035 entails rebuilding from nothing. A tabula rasa is literally translated as scrapped tablet. After the scrapping being done by the Israeli military, will come to the building of energy system, oil and gas rings and solar panels, and infrastructure, ports, airports, and railways that will move Gaza from crisis to prosperity. In other words, there will be thriving commercial center, but no longer a Palestinian political entity. Could we perhaps describe what you saw as being part of the Netanyahu government plans already in December 2023 and the current developments of the peace deal? Because in the peace deal, it's really interesting. The point 9, 10, 11 point exactly to this type of solution. I'm going to read the points. Says a Trump economic development plan to rebuild and energize Gaza will be created by convening a panel of experts who have helped birth some of the thriving modern miracle cities in the Middle East. And again, a special economic zone will be established with preferred tariffs and access rates to be negotiated with participating countries. So what is this all about? Why is it that it's not only destruction that is profitable in a capitalist economy? And just today, there is a new report released that says that Biden and Trump together gave at least $21.7 billion in aid to Israel, which we know ultimately means aid to international companies in the arms business. It's not just destruction that is profitable here, but the reconstruction plan is the real bounty that we see in Gaza, like in many other places.
Yeah, I mean, if you're thinking about the political economy of capitalism, this issue, this question of, tension between different capital groups is at the core of everything, right? And so clearly there is a group of businesses that are materially interested in continuing the war and the destruction. But as you say, the really big profits, the really big business is to be made in some sort of reconstruction peace. And, this has a history going back to the 1990s. I mean, the two-state solution of the 1990s, the Shimon Peres version of that, heavily backed by Clinton and the Europeans, was also an economic peace variant, but it basically was an economic peace that was supposed to underpin a two-state solution. So there was supposed to be a parallel evolution, at least to some degree, of a Palestinian and Israeli economy. And this didn't seem quite as crazy as it sounds now, because the Israeli economy then was not what it's become. It was itself recovering from deep economic crisis in the 1980s. I mean, the Israeli economy in the 80s was a debt-ridden, would have been dependent on the IMF if it hadn't had the absolute massive backing of the United States. So the idea was to stabilize both. This isn't an era of absolute massive oil affluence. And the idea is to have a kind of European-style du commerce development, co-development that will constitute peace. And what's happened over the course of the 2000s after the second Intifada and the preeminence increasingly of Netanyahu's group and the shifting of America's perspective is we're still with the economic peace vision, but it's now the Abraham Accords, and the deal is basically to try and marry a ultra high tech, super affluent Israel, which has a GDP per capita at the level of Germany and a debt level of like 60% of GDP. It's like in way better fiscal shape than America. It doesn't need any money from America, right? It has huge foreign exchange reserves, all deliberately built as part, I would see it as a grand strategy of sovereign independence, so as to be able to do this mega Sparta that Netanyahu talks about in extremists. On the one hand, marry that Israel to the mega affluence of the Gulf. The Saudis are the really big play, but if the worst comes to the worst, you settle for the Qataris and the Emiratis, who now are in a radically different level of economic development and affluence than they were in the early 1990s. And the key is, and if you can do that, you can just completely ignore the Palestinians, right? So whereas previously the economic peace was about stabilizing the two-state solution, now essentially the economic peace is about voiding the two-state solution. So you no longer have to take it seriously. And so this Gaza plan is the material, literally kind of the material realization of that. You obliterate Gaza, which is one of the great kind of wounds of Palestinian history. You literally just pave it over and build a mall and build a hotel complex and a EV manufacturing zone and a big solar field. And in due course, of course, the same fate befalls the West Bank as well. So that's the kind of underlying logic here, is that we move from economics as a stabilizer of the two-state solution to economics played at an even bigger level now, mega high-tech Israel with mega wealthy Gulf over the heads, and really as a way of erasing the Palestinian question. And that's, I think, what we're seeing again in these so-called peace plans is a depoliticized. I mean, it's bizarre. You and I have a lot of interest in like technocrats, but they explicitly say this is going to be run by they're going to be run by technocrats. It's not common for technocrats to literally write, "I am technocrat" on my forehead. Like, people label you technocrat once you're doing technocratic things. But in this case, they literally say there will be a technocratic government and it will be overseen by a board and the whole thing will be a Trump program. It's like that ghastly AI fantasy actually come to life. It's quite astonishing in how blatant it is, really.
Right. And it's about this plunder being disguised as some form of expertise, something that we also see in other contexts, such as Ukraine. I would just like to quote a passage because I think it's so fascinating. You write, "This is the new geoeconomics of our era. Vast visions of transport, infrastructure, and logistics, energized and inspired by a mixture of commercial interest, technological fascination, and geopolitical rivalry. These power moves are both massively political, defining who is in and who is out, and aggressively anti-political at one and the same time." Once there is a train that runs on time, the hope is that other questions will seem like irrelevancies. So first of all, the train's running on time and the
Mussolini,
illusion.
I was thinking of you, obviously when I write that, and this all is part of an infrastructure plan. Everything's about infrastructure these days. Daniela Gabor has a great line on this. Believe it or not, at the same time in 2024, they were doing these whopping great deals with India, of course, which once upon a time in the Biden era was part of this American grand strategy of encircling China. And they were going to bolt India in. And India, as we know, has maintained solidly good relations with Israel through all of this, unsurprisingly, given the Hindu national politics and the Muslim minority in Israel, in India. And the idea is to build some, they kind of draw these lines on the map, but there's one set of lines anyway that go from India through to the Gulf and then across the desert to Israel. And it's going to be, solar powered high speed railway, all the usual gizmos. And that was very much part of this vision of, and it's been going on. This is in the 2010s, right? So this is not something that suddenly cooked up as this annihilatory violence was unleashed after October 7th. This was in the works already in the 2010s. And one does have to credit Netanyahu with strategic vision in this respect. I mean, the guy does, he's not just a political survivor and a total cynic. He actually does have a kind of grand strategic vision. And these infrastructure projects are definitely part of that. And it is absolutely this combination of like a total rewriting of the politics of the space, but in the name of just, high speed logistics, just in time logistics, punctual trains, great container ports, all that good stuff.
So this peace deal, and no one knows what's going to happen yet, but clearly is a form of what Marxian economists would call primitive accumulation. It's part of making the land accessible even further to foreign power and speculation. And in doing so, pretending that there is some form of objective economic advancements in which all interests are united. What do you think about that?
I mean, you can go there, and there clearly is just a land grab going on at some level, and certainly the settler interest in Israel is principally interested in that. I mean, in my diagnosis, I think there's three levels. There's a settler interest, very powerful also in the West Bank, a big part of the Israeli real estate boom. Israel is a classic neoliberal real estate driven boom society. And believe it or not, building large apartment complexes in the West Bank is part of that. You can get mortgages on this thing. It's that's part of it. I think from the point of view of the most powerful centers of capital in Israel, which are really tech centered, they would rather we weren't doing this. If you're actually talking about the most powerful elements of Israeli tech, they were doing just fine before all the genociding started. And they were living very happily within a kind of apartheid type regime of labor. That worked for them. It was uncomfortable at some social level. The FT used to write little pieces about how this was quite difficult for people to deal with. But you carried on, as in so many other racially segregated labor markets. You live in Singapore for any time, you see exactly the same, not the same thing, but you see structures of inequality of a type which are very, very radical anywhere in sub-Saharan Africa all the time, right? And then there's a third element, which is the really grand strategic level. And the grand strategic level is this, reconfiguring the space, bolting Israel between India and the Gulf. And there, I think Gaza is really a road bump. You just need to clear it out of the way and put a good container port there. And for heaven's sake, can we please stop talking about this? And that's the violence. The violence is the erasure of the entire question of Palestine, less than, the kind of Nakba level, we take your land and put a kibbutz there. There are certainly some people in Israel still involved in that project and deeply committed to it. And in politics, for Netanyahu's coalition, they're vital. But we need to think of this as a complex assemblage of different elements. And the settler one is one element. The tech capital that would operate within a racially segregated kind of Middle Eastern economy. If you're in the Gulf, it's the same thing. As a white person, you suddenly discover you're in the kind of mercenary professional class. The real owners are the people of the Arab elite. And then there's the South Asian helot class below you. They could operate in a space like that. And then Netanyahu and the leadership, this geopolitical leadership, are playing this other game. And for different positions in that power complex, Gaza has a different role, I think. So I want to differentiate like that. I don't deny the land grab. I just don't know whether it's the principal vector here and whether, is Israel rich because of primitive accumulation? Israel exists because of primitive accumulation, but then its economy spirals off from the 90s, certainly, into a very, very different zone.
This is really important. How about the fact that this erasure of Gaza being led by technocrats? And I think this is where it gets interesting because it's about really hiding the economic and political violence behind some form of objective science, which is something that we see over and over in the history of our economic system. And we saw also very explicitly in Ukraine with the report that you talk about in one of your chart books from the Center for Economic Policy Research, published in September 2022, in which, in fact, you call it Keynesianism without the state, war Keynesianism without the state. But apart from getting into Keynesianism, which I hope will be a question of will be the topic of another conversation, you show how the crisis, and of course, this is also a big theme in the famous book of Naomi Klein, right? The shock doctrine. The crisis brings about opportunities to deregulate and impose hard dosages of austerity. Once you have a budgetary problem and you have an inflationary spiral, this is the best opening up moment to impose the usual recipe of huge labor markets deregulation and sacrifice of workers, which is actually something that you say even Zelensky was able to pass in Ukraine, having had opposition prior to the war to his plan of creating spaces to fire workers at will and get rid of the national legislation to protect labor that exists in Ukraine, together with, of course, the dismantlement of social services.
Yeah, I mean, I think the general point here is that political economy and class struggle and does not stop in a war. And it doesn't stop in a war which many people in the Ukrainian case think of as a good war, right? A struggle of Ukraine against the extraordinary breach of international law by Putin and the aggression of Russia. And Ukraine was a divided political economy from independence. In the early 1990s, it was hugely unstable. It's, by any macroeconomic measure, all of the macroeconomic measures suggested it was a very unsuccessful transition. It was hugely unequal, with a very, very powerful oligarch class. And it was vastly fragile in terms of its dependence on external funding. And of course, all of that just gets massively worse in the event of a war, notably the external dependence. And so what one has seen on and off in Ukraine, and it's an ongoing thing, and I intend to write about Ukraine if I can find the space in the next month or so, because the tension is mounting very dramatically. We spend a lot of time talking about cruise missiles and all of this kind of military hardware. But behind the scenes, the Ukrainian war economy is entering a really difficult phase. But we've been living through a kind of lull. Early on, however, in the war, there was a real risk of Ukraine accelerating towards not hyperinflation exactly, but very, very dramatic rates of inflation. And a quite serious struggle went on over Ukraine's political economy. And this is a struggle also in Israel on the Israeli side, if people can be bothered to spend any time like on the soul searching that goes on within Israel, because there is soul searching going on about how they fight wars. And like there's this argument that, Ukraine has survived because it has overcome Soviet legacies. It has stripped down. It's entrepreneurial. They're super good at military tech. They innovate all the time. The private sector is highly dynamic. And the answer of a certain contingent of Western advisors was that Ukraine could only prevail and go on in this war if they did even more of this, like a kind of anarcho-libertarian dismantling of the Ukrainian wartime state as they were fighting the Russians, on the kind of idea that this is ultimately the special source that has enabled the Ukrainians to put up this incredible resistance to the force of the Russian invasion. And this just struck me as, and I know there's a Ukrainian left which is much better informed about this than I'll ever be, and you should talk to some of those people. But my point was simply, wake up, smell coffee here. This is exactly as you say, the prosecution of a neoliberal restructuring experiment under the cover of a war and a war emergency. And this is very unlike the situation of, say, a war economy where you have full sovereignty, where you maybe have a balance of class power, like, say, in Britain during World War II, or to a degree even in the New Deal in the US, though there as well. Any history of the wartime economy in the US will tell you that the balance shifted towards business massively in the 1940s, not the same in Britain. So we need to get our model right. And Ukraine is and remains massively dependent on external capital, draws in support in part through promises of future development to come when Western capital will be welcomed to take advantage of the very considerable raw material resources. This is where a primitive accumulation story, I think, is more relevant, because Ukraine, not Gaza. That politics is playing out in the middle of this life and death struggle, which is claiming the lives of thousands of people a month, tens of thousands of people a month. If we believe the casualty figures, it's absolutely appalling.
And it's striking to me in reading this report, the way in which this cruelty emerges, the fact that you say that to argue for the fact that Ukraine should outsource its basic social function, they cite the fact that children, given that many children and young adults have left the country, the number, locations, and budgets of schools and universities can be recalibrated, freeing up resources for other uses. So the other use, of course, is the military, because the military expenditures are going up historically everywhere, as we know also in Europe today. The money there for the military expenditure is never useless or absent. It actually has to, the money elsewhere have to be shifted in that direction constantly.
There's such scorn for the Ukrainian public authorities. They literally argue the entire welfare state ought to be taken over by voluntarist Western NGOs. Like it's like in the middle of a war, which is the closest thing to total war that we've seen on this scale since World War II in the West. I mean, the Yugoslav wars were massive, but in intensity, but these are bigger protagonists than in Yugoslavia. The Ukrainians, we think, are spending 30% of GDP on the war effort. Like, this isn't quite World War II total for war, but it's a huge mobilization. And they say, oh well, yeah, really, we should just hand this over to the international NGO community. I mean, it's staggering. I mean, I don't think that particular report didn't go very far, but I think the conceptual point here is important, right? And that's presumably why we're talking about this, is that the point to make is that political economy doesn't sleep. It continues to grind forward, and it grinds forward under even the most extreme circumstances. And, you know, it's maybe not always going to be the way ultimately to explain what's going on. I don't think the war in Gaza is being waged to realize property development projects. I think there's deeper motives for it. But nevertheless, once you've got a war going, there are going to be property development projects. And it's going to be impossible to wage a modern war without the mobilization of huge amounts of economic and technological resource. And so this is a way in, and it's a way in to understand all of the different conflicts which are sucked into the cauldron of a war, and the way in which wars can dynamize, inflect, change the path of those other struggles.
Yeah, and I guess the point is, in this development of hopefully the after genocide Gaza, if there will be an after, we need to be very wary of people who present themselves as experts, because behind expertise, the political economy is not neutral, and neither thus is the models that justify certain policies. And in this sense, I think, Adam, what is interesting is to see all the different faces these austerity crusades take, right? Because we know that in Israel itself, Israel has been applying a hard dosage of austerity on its own population, making it one of the most unequal countries in the world. So clearly not all Israelis are benefiting from these austerity policies. And of course, then we know that austerity was a big problem for the PA, given the constraints, budgetary constraints that were also imposed from the outside. So austerity happening within countries, Italy, France, Israel, austerity being applied to countries that are subordinated, such as countries, they're not even country, territories that are subordinated, such as Gaza, austerity implemented through external pressure in Ukraine. And this story seems to have a longer trajectory, all the way back to the book that made you famous, Wages of Destruction, in which you tell a story that is extraordinarily similar to a lot of the dynamics we see today in terms of the type of austerity pressures Germany was put under immediately after the First World War, and the way in which militarization boosted in Germany because of these economic pressures, thanks to also the suppression of labor costs, which we know is an integral part of the austerity recipe. And ultimately, the story that we're telling now connected to, of course, the Holocaust and the World War II, the massive need for Germany to expand. But you explain in that book that the expansion, the invasion of Poland from Germany had an economic motivation, a pressure that had emerged out of Germany having to implement a lot of austerity to please the international technocrats and the international world order. So themes that constantly reemerge, how austerity takes all these different faces, but the bottom line is that internal class warfare against the working class is going hand in hand with these geopolitical conflicts. What do you think about these historical parallels, and how can your analysis on Germany in the interwar period be helpful to understand the longue durée of these type of policies?
I mean, it's a very wide field that you open up. I mean, let me try and make the bridge to where we started, which is to say that from the early 20th century, late stage imperialism begins to think in increasingly disinhibited ways about how to square these circles of domestic class politics and struggle and entrenched ideas about population and space and settlement and colonization and raw materials and what Hitler will call living space. And this conversation takes lots of different forms in that period, and Nazism is one of them. Japanese programs of settlement in Manchuria are another. Italian projects in Libya and Abyssinia are another. I thought when you mentioned 36, you were going to start with Abyssinia. And Zionism as a settler colonial project is very just much of its period, right? I was reading the other day that there was a Zoroastrian program for settlement with British sponsorship in Iran. Like, everyone was looking to Britain to sponsor their colonial project somewhere in some vacant, quote unquote, space. And these projects have a 50-year history, really, that runs from the late 19th century through to 48, 49, 50. That's kind of where they really run their course. In internal colonization within China, the settlement of the Great North is a project of the 1950s. You could see that maybe as the end point of these projects. And I think of the Israeli land seizure and the settlement of the Israeli state as a relatively, in the broader scheme of things, compared to the Indian partition or the displacement of German populations from Eastern Europe, it's a relatively small scale program of a type that's very familiar all over the world at that point. It's novel in that it's state founding, and that's unusual as opposed to state expanding. And it's novel because it continues. The extraordinary thing about it is that it's incomplete in its first phase, because the Nakba, as brutal as it was, does not finish the job. And it goes on, and it's ongoing. And settler politics is alive and well as an aggressive form of self-assertive politics in the present moment. And the only obvious analogues would be something like, right-wing settler ideology in the interior of the Amazon in Brazil or somewhere like that. That's another instance of a kind of relatively familiar 20th century form of settler project that still has some real juice to it. But in most other places, there are commodity frontiers. Clearly in Africa, the cocoa frontier moves, for instance, and this produces large movements of people. In Sudan, one of the big drivers across that end of the Sahel is gold, and the movement of groups of people and economic interests, which are sometimes very far flung out to the Emirates, where the great gold market is, that drive the conflict in Sudan. But in terms of a state-centered, sponsored project, the Israeli one, I think, is really the only one that still has that momentum that comes from a moment of, and this doesn't mean they're all the same, right? The Israeli project is not the same as the apartheid project, or the same as the Nazi project, or the same as the Japanese colonization project, but they have structural analogies and structural logics which do come out of a common context. And there's a lot of really brilliant historical work now on the thinking of Zionist projects in the 30s and 40s about this question of, a two-state, a state in which Jews and Palestinians live side by side, or the possibility of maintaining that. So that would be the way I would kind of frame this this analysis. And there are indeed certain kind of common logics, and those kind of projects can in fact be chained together. Right? There are a whole series of extraordinarily deals done between the early kibbutz and the Nazi regime over foreign exchange, and basically exchanging oranges for people to get Jews out of Nazi Germany and Austria in the 1930s in exchange for citrus fruit, which the Germans would otherwise have to pay hard currency for. There is the prospect of a giant buyout in 38-39, which ties hard currency limitations. The Germans imagine there is such a thing as world Jewry, with which you could somehow bargain and extract money in exchange for migrants. There's a whole world of options that open up, which would have effectively turned the Nazi regime into a flywheel of Jewish migration to Palestine. Not in the sense of mass flight in the terror, but in the sense of an economic mechanism to enable this to happen. It's a menagerie of different visions of settlement, of imperial project, of racialized land seizures, that has a kind of, it's very common up to the 1950s and now increasingly rare to have that spelled out with the explicitness that we still see, certainly on the part of the settler wing of Israeli politics in the present day.
I'm wondering about what the history of Nazi Germany that you trace from the success of Hitler as a political leader connected to the economic hardship that the German population had to face, of course, in the 1920s. And then the story you tell about the pressure to indeed use this extraordinary amount of military arsenal that Germany propped up. How can this story help us understand, and this is where we would like to close today the conversation with you, how can it help us understand the present situation? Europe that is arming, massively rearming. We know that all countries are meant to increase their percentage of GDP that are they're planning to spend on the military up to even 5%, not caring at all about any budgetary constraints and fiscal rule at this point. But how is this going to escalate, as you show it happened with Nazi Germany, a possibility of another serious conflict? And how much is this allowed to happen also because of the pressure to boost the economy where it can be boosted while not boosting it in the direction of social expenditures, because that is considered, in a way, potentially destabilizing for class relations in terms of potentially giving too much to people when you do need these people to abide to lower wages in order for them to continue their low-paying jobs and to foster the service economy that a lot of these countries in Europe are dependent on.
No, I mean, I think it's incredibly telling that we've seen this pivot in Europe away from, what at various phases in 2019, 2020 looked like a fairly all-embracing vision of a green, high-tech modernization of the European economy, to a much more narrow gauge, as you say, like military industrial project, which in an extraordinary telling move has essentially had the fiscal brakes taken off it. And it really is a disastrous declension. And it points to a huge failure, I think, of the European political class to be willing to face the problem of how to negotiate peace in a multipolar world, and instead a kind of clenched, desperate effort to get in the good graces of, the Trump administration, who've set this target. And so Europe said, okay, fine. Yep, that's what we'll try and do. Now, whether they'll actually deliver, I think, is another question. Because around the edges, that fiscal austerity habit is a really hard one to break. And it's going to be interesting to see what happens in France, in coming months. But that is, I agree with you, a really extraordinary kind of about turn from what, on a maybe overly charitable interpretation could have been seen was seen by the Chinese, as I've been able to establish recently, in their thinking about the green energy transition as a model, as an example of a comprehensive vision of win-win green modernization, to a hard militarism-driven strategy. The latest news from Rheinmetall being celebrated, the notorious German armaments manufacturer, as a great news for European industrialism, and the Draghi report doubling down on capitalist oligopoly and hard power as the way forward. It's a stark turn. Yeah.
It's a stark turn, but also I think revealing of certain tendencies that are just being made more obvious. The fact that austerity has never been about balancing the budget, the fact that austerity has always been for a larger motive of preserving the interest of capital holders while keeping the working class at bay. This is being revealed very clearly, I think, with the current policies, not only here in the United States with Trump, but also in Europe, this idea that we're not paying for a preschool, we're not paying for this increasing number of poor people that are being impoverished by the economy as we speak, but we are going to pay for Leonardo and other huge military corporations that keep increasing their political and economic power. It's more than ever obvious how this economy operates with a lot of violence involved. And so I guess having you here with us today helps try to give some clarity to certain tendencies that require a lot of attention in this historical moment, because more than ever, I think right now, scholars have the duty to confront what is not just inexplicable violence, but violence that is deeply connected to the economic functioning of our economy. Thank you, Adam, for being with us. It was so important to have this conversation with you. I hope our listeners can subscribe to your chart book and follow your podcast, Ones and Twos, that comes out every Thursday. And in general, we hope to have you with us again. And I can't wait to see you in New York when I come visit.
Yeah, likewise. Miss you. It's great to talk.
Lovely to talk to you.